All right, so let's get into the four different types of bureaucratic structures. And again, we'll look at each of these four one at a time. So first up are the cabinet departments, and we touched on these very, very briefly in our discussion of the executive branch. So just as a quick kind of refresher on those, there are currently 15 cabinets, 15 major departments in the United States, and again, I've got their seals here before you. Each of them are more or less independent from one another. So, for example, Department of Agriculture deals with one area of thing. Department of Veterans Affairs deals with another set of things, and for the most part, they operate largely independently of one another. Now, at the end of the day, they are all part of the executive branch, and so they do all report to the president. But again, they do exercise their own autonomy. Each of them have their own budgets, staff, and again their own areas that they are concerned with. And these are massive segments of the government. And so as a result, as any one of these grows, so too does the government's number one ability to regulate or enforce policy in these areas, but also it's going to grow the size of government. So the more authority, power, people, dollars, whatever that any one of these departments or all of them combined, so the more they have, the more they are able to enforce the federal statutes or federal laws. So again, that is certainly useful. It has its place in society, but the major question is always, but to what extent, right? The heads of each of these departments is titled a secretary, and the secretary is somebody who is appointed by the president, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So here's one area where both the executive and legislative branches are sharing power here, right? This is a separation of power, so neither the president nor Congress can have complete control over these things. Most of the staffers below the secretary, so the assistants and just the regular people kind of doing the jobs, they are for the most part independently. They get their jobs because they earn them, right? So they are not political appointees, unlike some of the other areas under the White House structure, directly under the White House structure. Again, we've got these major heads of policy areas. Their jurisdiction is something that is legislated by Congress. So Congress will tell, okay, Department of Homeland Security, here is the stuff that you are supposed to be looking out for. Here is how much money you've got to do with it, or rather, you've got to do those things. So have at it. Right. So again, we've got some congressional control, some executive control. So it is something that is sort of shared, although for the most part, the executive branch is able to, excuse me, the president is able to exercise a bit more control, simply because these departments are part of the executive structure. They are, again, below the White House. Moving into our next type, we have government corporations, and the two most prominent kinds of government corporations are going to be the post office, so the USPS, and also Amtrak, which doesn't really have a big presence here in the South, but if you go up to the Northeast, where there are higher concentrations of people that are closer to one another, there are a number of commuter trains and trains that just kind of run from city to city that help folks move around a little bit more. So these just kind of have those in mind as we discuss them. Government corporations are these forms of bureaucratic agencies that operate mostly on their own. They usually don't get funding from the government. So to fund all of the postal service stuff, right? So to pay the letter carriers and to pay for the trucks and the gas to get your mail from point A to point B, that's all going to be self-funded. So we pay for that through stamps most directly. So these organizations, they are mostly on their own, and the reason that they are created is because they were seen as having a very important role, something that we wanted to ensure the presence of, so much so that we didn't want to just leave it up to the private sector to kind of fill in this gap. And if you think about it, that makes sense that these two particular government corporations are present, right? We, as a democratic representative society, need to have information. The flow of information is so crucially important that the government has opted to ensure that everyone has regular access to that information. And this is going to come in the form of letters, of newspapers, of magazines, right? It's a little bit different today since we have the internet, and that's how most people will communicate and get news from. But especially for most of our country's history, right? People didn't have that as an option. So we needed to be able to correspond with friends in other cities or other states and say, hey, what's going on in Virginia? Let me tell you all about this new governor we have in Texas. And here's some of the policies. And so, right, it helped to facilitate the spread of information from one person to another person, from one area of the country to another. With these railroad companies, right, we have an emphasis on the flow of goods and people, right? We are an economic oriented country. So for us to be able to support our economy, support to create jobs and maintain jobs, right? We need to get goods from one place to another. So again, we wanted to ensure that there was one way to make sure that that was possible. The post office delivers mail to every address in the entire United States. If you could imagine that if this was left up to a private company, well, everybody would be bidding on, well, I want to be the mail carrier for Houston, I want to be the mail carrier for Los Angeles or for New York City, right? Because these are huge, massive cities. There's going to be tons and tons of people, and that will mean tons and tons of mail and newspapers circulating around. But who's going to want to drive 40 miles out of their way to deliver mail to that one tiny little town way up in the Rocky Mountains that there are 4 people that live there, right? That'd be cost prohibitive to do that. So we wanted to ensure that something like this was available to folks, and so we have these government corporations. Next up are regulatory agencies, and these go by a few different names. We've also, sometimes they're called regulatory commissions, other times independent regulatory commissions. But whatever the title is, we have that notion of regulatory, right? So these are focused on some sort of regulation or some sort of creating laws or rules. Another important part is to note that they are independent. So these folks are supposed to make their decisions without any regard to politics, without any regard to who is the president, who is the congressperson at this particular point in time, or who's in charge of this committee in the Senate, right? That's not their focus. Their focus is you and me. So in the bottom right corner, we see something like the EPA, for example, which is focused on protecting the environment for us. And just like our previous examples, the government corporations, these regulatory agencies generally don't get exact day-to-day guidance from the government. Somebody like the EPA, hey, you're tasked with protecting the environment. And actually, I'll get a few examples here. So we'll just kind of look at these. So EPA, again, tasked with regulating the environment and pollutions and things like that. And you'll remember the example we had in the first section where we were asking the different presidents how much lead in the water is acceptable, right? Politicians don't know. So for the most part, politicians don't really legislate how many parts per million of lead in water is okay, right? They leave that up to the EPA. Now, a lot of times Congress or president will kind of exert some weight and say, hey, lay off of these regulations, or hey, you'd better start enforcing more border patrols, or something like that, right? So sometimes the executive or legislative branches can get themselves involved, but for the most part, they're going to be on their own. A couple other examples of these regulatory agencies, again, these independent regulatory agencies that are looking out for you and me, is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. This was part of Roosevelt's New Deal, so the package of plans that and agencies that were created following the Great Depression. The SEC is tasked with regulating the stock market, so making sure that people who are buying the stock market, or sorry, buying stocks and selling stocks are paying full value, that there's no trying to hide investments. There is no trying to hide how much a company is actually worth, right? Saying, oh, we're worth $20 million when really they've got $100 in the bank, right? So the SEC is looking out for that. So again, that we are protected. You and I are protected against another stock market crash. Finally, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, one of their major focuses is kind of divvying up the airwaves. So if you turn your radio station to, I don't know, 88.7 or something like that, you only get one station, right? So somebody has to pay for that license to broadcast at that exact frequency so that there's not 20 different people all in this area trying to broadcast on that one station and just kind of causing confusion and chaos. And they're also involved in broadband internet issues as well. Finally, we come to the independent executive agencies. Again, we see that word independent. So these are groups that also operate largely on their own, right? They can get guidance from, but not really day-to-day instruction from people like the president or Congress and things like that. These independent executive agencies, such as the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, or NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, these groups are often tasked with things that are pretty sensitive. So things that might have a lot of secrets involved in them, or a lot of proprietary information that maybe we don't want our enemies to get a hold of. So rather, again, than leaving something like spying up to some private company who is possibly going to just simply go after the highest bidder, right, we want to have this as part of the government structure itself, so that it all stays in-house, so to speak. And with NASA, one of the early areas that they were really focusing on was rocketry. And it doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination to say, oh, hey, this rocket that can blast 10 people from Earth onto the moon and back, well, maybe we could also strap a whole bunch of explosives to the back of this rocket and blow up our enemy, right? So these are very proprietary, secretive things that we want to kind of keep a lid on as much as we can. So again, they are going to be operating largely by themselves and in areas of particular sensitivity or secret, particularly secretive things. So we've looked at kind of the place in America that bureaucracies hold, and we looked at the different structures so far. And so we'll spend a quick moment just looking at the people who staff these bureaucracies. The folks who work at a given bureaucracy are generally called a bureaucrat, right? So we can kind of see the overlap in bureaucracy, bureaucrat. And early on in our country's history, and actually for a whole chunk of it, these positions were filled through a process known as patronage. So if you were, for example, supportive of a president, or if you gave a bunch of money to some governor who won an election, well, that governor, that president, they're going to remember you. And they'll say, man, Dr. Russell, I'm really so thankful that you gave me $10 million. I know you have that kind of cash laying around, but it means a lot to me. It really helped me get reelected. So as a thank you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you the ambassador to England. And hey, over here, I see that you gave me $600, and hey, that means a lot to me. So I'm going to make you the Postmaster General for all of Texas. So you're in charge of all the mail in Texas. Great. Figure that out, right? So this is a way of kind of saying thank you to people who donated money to you. So take a moment. What would be a pro? What would be a con of this particular system? It's also known as the spoils system. Well, as you can imagine, the people that are going to get these jobs, they are going to be somebody who's loyal to the person in charge. So that means that they are going to try to do as best they can to kind of follow the wishes or the order of the president or the governor, whoever it was that gave them that job to begin with. But at the same time, just because you've got a bunch of cash laying around doesn't mean you know how to be a good ambassador, or doesn't mean that you know how to run a post office, right? So oftentimes the government was simply used as a way to reward your friends and your allies, and it was a good way to give them a cush, guaranteed job for the next however many years you were in office. Over time, a lot of folks increasingly see the negative side of this thing, right? Because there was, as a result of the spoils system or this patronage system, a lot of waste, a lot of money that was gone. A lot of projects that were started that the people didn't know how to operate. And so folks wanted to kind of try to figure out a new way to fill the bureaucracy. This movement sort of came to a head when, in 1881, then President Garfield was shot by somebody who believed that Garfield owed him one of these positions. Right, so this guy had written a speech on behalf of Garfield and published it and stuff like that. But and so thinking that this speech was the thing that got Garfield the election, he expected a job out of it. Months go by into Garfield's term of office, and this guy still hasn't gotten his job yet, and so he gets really upset. He confronts the president about it after trying several other channels, and when things look like it's not going to go his way, he shoots the president, and the president would eventually die from those wounds. So to help kind of avoid problems like that going forward, as well as addressing a whole host of other problems, Congress passed the Pendleton Act. This is going to be in 1883. And what this does is it sets up the government bureaucracy, and kind of titles it as a civil service, right? It notes that this group of people is in service of civility, of the civilization, of the citizens, rather than, hey, this is just a little grab bag of treats for whoever happens to be in charge. So the civil service sets up guidelines and principles on how people are going to be hired, and what it uses is known as the merit principle. So the or a merit principle says, hey, you are deserving of a job, you're worthy of this position, and so you're going to get it. The Almost every single non-elected governmental position is still based on the merit principle. So for most government jobs, if you want to get a job with the government, you also have to take a test, and that test is going to determine, whether or not you have the basic qualifications for this particular job. Recently, I was teaching in Dallas ISD, and to get a job with the Texas Public Schools, or rather with Dallas Public Schools, I had to take a test, and so I was teaching a variety of social studies courses, and so to prove that I could in fact teach that, I had to sit down and take a test, and the test covered things like government, and U.S. history and world history and psychology and economics, maybe sociology. I forget offhand, but I had to take this test and show, hey, I do know what I'm talking about. And on top of that, I had to take another test that showed that I was able to not only have the knowledge, but relay that in a meaningful way to students. So I had to take two tests just to get into a high school classroom in public schools here in Texas. That approach is still taken today, and the Office of Personnel Management is the arm of the government that really kind of dives into, or sorry, doesn't dive into, but is focused on these hiring and firing practices. And again, none of these are mostly nonpartisan. So just because you vote Republican and there's now a Democrat in the office or something like that, you are protected. So given that, kind of take a moment and consider some pros and cons of the merit-based system, if you would. So I've noted that there is a whole bunch of authority kind of flowing to the bureaucracy. The EPA, for example, is able to make their own regulations, come up with their own laws and rules, and enforce those laws and rules. And if people don't follow them, the EPA can punish you for not following these rules, right? So there's a lot of authority going away from the elected branches of government. But that being said, there's still a number of ways that the elected officials can control and keep tabs on the bureaucracy itself. Starting with the executive branch. The executive branch can issue executive orders, right? Those things that are the executive ordering somebody to do something. So if the president thinks the EPA is going too hard or too soft on environmental regulations, well, hey, the president can say, hey, EPA, take it easy, or hey, EPA, ramp up your inspections, right? Whatever they want to do, that's the president can do that. The president also, at least modern presidents, have a very big role in the budget making process. So the president, if they think that Department of Homeland Security needs more agents checking more bags at more airports, well, the president can work to insert more money and earmark so much money to hire X number of additional baggage checkers or something like that. The president also has some limited authority over of hiring and firing within the bureaucracy itself. And again, this is going to mostly be at the top levels of departments and agencies and things like that. But you can certainly have a lot of influence. Leaders can certainly exert a lot of influence over the folks below them. Moving on to congressional. The Congress has constitutional authority to change the focus or the areas of concern of any of these bureaucracies. They just simply have to pass a law that says, hey, EPA, you're disbanded. See ya. And they could do that. Or they can say, hey, EPA, you are required to go to every factory at least twice a year. Great. You have to do that now. Further, Congress is in charge of money. Right? So the president can certainly have a hand in creating a budget, but Congress is the one who has the final say in what it's going to look like. And Congress is the one who appropriates money. Remember, Congress has the power of the purse to ensure that money is spent as they see fit. Finally, Congress can also have what are known as oversight hearings. So to oversee something means to kind of look over it, watch over it, make sure that things are going as they ought to be. So anybody, really almost anybody in the country, Congress can subpoena and bring them into Congress and say, hey, we want you to tell us about blah, whatever. So if they want to know about asbestos, right, they can put you under oath just like you would in a courtroom. Hey, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And then, well, you'd better do that. They can require documents to be produced. So Congress has a very powerful tool in the ability to in their oversight function to really have an idea of what's going on, and if there are things that they like, great, more money for those things, or if things are not going as planned, they can redirect the agency as they see fit. And last but certainly not least at this point, even the judicial branch has some controls over the bureaucracy. Judges can issue what are known as injunctions. Injunctions are sort of temporary, stop what you're doing. So if there's a suspected leak at some chemical plant, the judge can issue a temporary injunction, say, hey, plant, we think that this is a problem, but we need you to shut down just in case, right? And so this can happen just immediately, whereas an investigation and taking oaths and getting people on to give depositions and collecting evidence and things like that might take a while, but in that meantime, a whole bunch of pollution could be released. So injunctions can tell people, got to do something temporarily, or you got to stop doing something temporarily. Further, the federal courts have judicial review. So if somebody sues a federal bureaucracy, if the courts believe that the bureaucracy, the agency, is doing something unconstitutional or illegal or violating somebody's civil rights, whatever the case might be, the courts can tell them to stop. They can invalidate whatever authority the bureaucratic agency was using in the first place. So even though we see a lot of power flowing away from the three branches through the bureaucracy, there are still certainly ways to check that fourth branch of government. So hey, since we can kind of make sure that bureaucracies are accountable, make sure that they are listening to the elected officials, great. Nothing we have to worry about, right? Sounds fantastic. We can call it a day. But we can't, right? Remember, humans are humans, and humans have a great propensity to screw things up, whether on purpose or not. And so we see these same exact issues, right, that we saw with politicians on an earlier slide in the same presentation. Bureaucrats are just people. Even though bureaucrats might be experts in their field, even experts who are super smart like myself get things wrong sometimes. It's been known to happen where a scientist just collected the data wrong or contaminated a sample, or even I spoke incorrectly, right? I know. Brace yourself, right? I don't mean to undercut everything you've come to believe in so far in this course, but it happens. So we have to be very concerned that even bureaucrats make mistakes. So we, as citizens, got to be on the watch, got to be on the lookout, just like we do with our elected officials. So at that point, I'm going to pause and we'll jump over to our last segment in just a moment. So see you over there.